Our historical ignorance is a big reason why we're here today. And when I say historical ignorance, it's not what you think it is. There's a lesson that the Romans learned in the Third Punic War that America never applied. And that's the biggest reason, I would argue, that we are where we are today. So stick with me here. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Punic Wars, it was a series of 3 wars between Rome and Carthage. But I'm only going to focus on the third one because that's where the lesson sits. Rome had already engaged in 2 different wars with Carthage over a period of close to 50 years. The Third Punic War was finally where Rome put the nail in the coffin. They laid siege to Carthage, burned the city to the ground, enslaved all their people, and killed everybody else. And the myth goes that Rome salted the earth so nothing would ever grow there again. Now, we know that that's not true, but it makes for a good story. That's where the lesson sits that the US forgot. One of the things that Sun Tzu often says, or is attributed to saying, is that you need to wage war on the terms of your enemies, which means you have to do 2 things. If the enemy dictates the terms of how the battle is to be conducted, you need to match those terms and use those tactics and practices that are uniquely yours to exploit the weaknesses in the enemy. And why that's important is because this is a lesson that the US never applied. So let's think about it. The Civil War was fought largely over what? The question of whether states are allowed to own people. And the Civil War ended with the Confederacy losing. But the lesson that the US failed to understand was the lesson from the Third Punic War. Instead of burning the South to a cinder, the US allowed the South to get off the hook. Wealthy industrialists from the North saw an opportunity to make money, and they backed out of Reconstruction, which allowed for Jim Crow to take hold. Because of how the post-Reconstruction era South reconstituted itself and allowed the myth of the lost cause and all of the narratives about plucky rebels and all that stuff to persist, they created a society that was separate from the broader United States and still incorporated a lot of the issues that existed in the era of slavery. It was just packaged differently. And here's why that's important. When we look at the Mustache Guy, he built a big segment of his thought process from what he learned and studied about the American South. What should have happened in the American South in the post-Civil War era was that it should have been burnt to a cinder, and all those wealthy Northern industrialists who wanted to capitalize on the oppression that would continue in the post-Reconstruction era should have been dealt with at that time. If that was done, the template would not have been established for the Mustache Guy to do what he did. So that was the first mistake. The second mistake the US made was that in the era of the Mustache Guy, the US never went after the billionaires that were located in the US that helped Mustache Guy gain a foothold. Those companies never paid a price after the war. And to make it even worse, once the war ended, all of the high-ranking officials within the Mustache Guy's operation weren't exterminated. Many of them were brought here in Operation Paperclip and embedded themselves in all sorts of different organizations, like NASA, the CIA, and so on. So you have people of an ideology that's aligned with the Jim Crow era South and committed some of the worst atrocities in the history of man are brought into the fold when they should have had their backs against the wall, and the last thing they saw was a flash of light. But the US didn't do that. Now we're in the third opportunity, which brings us to today. What do we see today? We see a repeat of what Mustache Guy wanted to do and what the slavers of the South wanted to do. And you have all of these billionaires who are lining up to bring in the golden age. And you have a regime in power who are abducting people in broad daylight using shock troops and mass vigilantes to disappear them into concentration camps and death camps located all across the country. And they're celebrating and selling merch because they get to look at the extermination of brown and black faces and treat it as a sport. We would never have gotten here if people in the US from a historical perspective weren't ignorant of history. If they had dealt with the South the same way that the Romans dealt with Carthage in the Third Punic War, we wouldn't be here. But this is where we are now. And we see what's happening. And the question becomes, are we going to let it go a third time and let these ideologies fester? Are we going to let the architects of this extermination that is about to take place get off scot-free? That is a question for the history books. Is this the moment where we finally learn our lesson and do what is necessary?